Okay, hi everyone. So today we will be finishing up the aggregation part of the last lecture. Especially like we talked about basic aggregation methods such as histograms, and then we talked about spatial aggregation using Voronoi diagrams, and a little bit about gerrymandering and so on. Now in the next 30 minutes I'll be talking about clustering and dimensionality reduction. I'm going to give you kind of an intuitive understanding of how clustering works, but I'm not going to go into the detail on the math, and the same is true for PCA and MDS. And after that, we'll do this exercise that I mentioned on Slack. So roughly at 2:30 I'll stop wherever I am so that we have enough time for this exercise. And then I will continue next, like the exercise is related to sets, which is kind of the topic of today's lecture. And I will probably, or very surely not, get to do a lot of sets and text visualization because of this exercise today. So I will be teaching that on Tuesday, and then I will move into storytelling on Tuesday if we have time. And then the other two lectures that are still open for the rest of the semester are the designing visualizations. How do we actually get to develop cool visualizations? How do we talk to people, users, and so on, kind of understanding the process and validation. And so my guess at this point is that I won't probably have full two lectures for those two topics, and so I might actually merge them to some degree, but we'll see. And then I also posted about readings on Slack. To make sure that you read the readings that are associated with the lecture that is upcoming. I'm only going to test those readings that we actually cover in class. So if we, for example, miss out on the whole evaluation lecture, and then we'll miss out on the reading, and so that won't be in the test, obviously. Okay, anything other administrative that we should talk about? Yeah.
The reading, is that both for graduate and undergraduate students?
Well, they both should read it, but again, I'm only going to ask stuff that is only in the readings, not in my slides, or not in my presentation for graduates. So there's going to be similar to the previous exam, where there's one questions on details that we didn't really cover in class for grad students. Any other administrative things? So you should have, like, at least by tomorrow, every group should have met with their TA. This meeting is mandatory, so if you haven't met yet, then please reach out to your TA or reach out to me immediately after class. Okay, so what is clustering? Clustering is the classification of items into similar bins, and what is similar is kind of like hard to describe. And so we, to kind of like get an idea of similarity, also from a mathematical sense, we use different similarity measures. Like the simplest one is of course the Euclidean distance, so like a spatial distance. We can calculate the Pearson correlation or many other similarity measures. It can be something completely custom to your data sets. And then I like to distinguish between like 4 types of clustering algorithms that are relevant for visualization. These are partitional algorithms. Partitional algorithms take a set of items and divide it into a set of bins, uniquely. The number of bins is either manually set, for example, as in Kmeans, or it can be automatically determined, as in affinity propagation. Hierarchical algorithms produce a similarity tree, a dendrogram, so we'll be talking more about what that means later, but essentially it gives us like a similarity structures between items, individual items and clusters, and then we can use this hierarchy, this tree, to cut at an arbitrary point and then therefore create a distinct clustering. And these hierarchical algorithms are great if you don't know how many clusters you expect in your data set and you kind of want to explore different cuts. Biclustering is an approach, like up to this point I've always said the clustering of items, but of course if you have a matrix you can cluster in columns and in items, or in columns and in rows. And biclustering optimizes the clusters based on both dimensions and records. And sometimes this is something that you want to do. And I guess fuzzy clustering is a natural way of thinking about cluster assignments because it allows the occurrence of elements in multiple clusters. It essentially gives you just a probabilistic assignment of an item to a cluster. So it tells you, well, I'm pretty sure with 95% confidence that this item is in this cluster, or it tells you this item is borderline, like there's only a 40% chance that it's in this cluster, there's a 30% chance that it's in this other cluster. And fuzzy clustering is pretty tricky to visualize, obviously, because we have these fuzzy borders. So why do we care about clustering applications for visualization? So first, clustering is of course important for many tasks when I don't know, or when I don't have a labeled data set where I could use supervised machine learning to kind of like understand some high level structure. So that in its own right is of course super important, and then in visualization we care about visualizing those higher level structures. But you can also use clustering as a means to improve visualization techniques. So for example, clusterings can be used to order. So for example, I've shown you lots of matrix-based displays, like matrices for graphs or matrices in the form of heat maps, and all of them needed to have some ordering for pixel-based techniques that you could see structure. And you can, and it's commonly used, and you can commonly apply clustering algorithms to do that. Then for brushing, we can essentially use clusters to select items that are similar to each other in geometric techniques such as parallel coordinates. And then we can use clustering to aggregate, essentially to simplify. And aggregation is essentially one of the key aspects of clustering. If we aggregate, we work under the assumption, which is of course what clusters are supposed to do, these clusters themselves are more homogeneous than a whole data set. So if I find a cluster, I can actually probably create a pretty meaningful abstraction of it that doesn't need to show every single data item. So statistical measures such as like what is the distribution and so on is less noisy and more meaningful if I apply it to clusters instead of to a whole data set. So this is an example that I showed a couple of times. This is actually using clustering to in both directions, in dimensions and in records, to show us the structure that we see here. And again, here's a geometric technique that doesn't use this the parallel coordinates plot. So here we can't really leverage clustering, and we don't see that structure that we can clearly see here. This is a technique for cluster comparison. So we have two, you can think of this as the same data set here and here, clustered, for example, with two different algorithms, and so we can make comparisons of what do those clustering algorithms produce. That is a common thing because clustering is not an exact science, right? They can't really, like if I do supervised machine learning, I can kind of like evaluate my accuracy. In clustering, since I don't have ground truth, I can't actually do that. And so usually what happens is you run a couple of different clustering algorithms and then use some evaluation methods, some statistical evaluation methods like a Jaccard index, or some visual inspection method like this method here to compare what are good clustering results. And so this is an example where we use clustering for aggregation. So you can see that this is like a high dimensional data set where we have 4 different groups, but the clusters here are in the vertical direction. And you can see that some of these blocks that represent, let's say, 5 dimensions by 200 records, they show every item in detail in the parallel coordinates plots, but others only show like a summary here. So we can see that this cluster here pretty faithfully represents, or we can assume that this cluster here, like this very simple encoding with only those 5 colored fields, pretty faithfully represents the underlying cluster. Here is a variation of this down here that also shows us, like here we have 2 green and 3 red ones, so we see that there's like a trend, an obvious trend in this data set. And the little triangles here show you a little bit of the standard deviation in the cluster. I guess it's a little bit hard to see from further back. So how does Kmeans work? The goal of Kmeans is to minimize the aggregate intercluster distance, kind of to minimize the inertia. We kind of want to minimize the total square distance from a point to the center of its cluster, and this also corresponds to the variance for the Euclidean distance, and it's kind of like a measure of how internally coherent clusters are. And so how does the algorithm work? You take as an input a set of records from x1 to xn and a k. So a k here is user specified with a number of clusters. And then you pick some k starting points as centroids. You can randomly pick your k starting points from the set of points, or you can pick also random seeds that are not in the point set. And then you run a loop. While your clustering algorithm hasn't converged, for each point xi, find the closest centroid cj. Then for every CJ, calculate the distance between the centroid and the point, and then assign X to the cluster J that has the smallest distance. So I'll show this intuitively intuitively in a second. And then for each cluster J, compute a new centroid CJ by calculating the average of all Xi assigned to cluster J. So what it means is essentially for every given loop, I look at the set of points, assign each point to its closest centroid, and then I update my centroids so that the centroid is in the middle of the points that I've assigned to it. And I repeat this until convergence, and there's a couple of different criteria to terminate that loop. Like one simple one is no point has changed the cluster, the distance between an old and a new centroid is below a certain threshold, or if we want to limit the number of iterations, we could have that as a stopping criterion too. So here's an example. I initialize this. Here the squares are the data points and the dots here are the centroids. And then I assign each of the points to the clusters. And so obviously this point here is going to be assigned to the red centroid, this here to the green, and this probably to the green. And so if we look at this, we will see that we have now essentially like here one cluster, then here all these points are in this cluster, and then all these points are in this cluster. And now we update the centroids based on the points that are in the cluster. So the first point here, the first centroid here, the first cluster has only with a single point. So the centroid is going to perfectly coincide with that point. And then this here moves down because we have included some further points from that, and this here moves to the right. And then we reassign the clusters. We do this step again, and then we get an updated clustering. And so we keep iterating until no point changes position, for example. So here is a good example for doing this. So here I'm picking a couple of like points here, and then I can actually pick seeds. And now if I pick my cluster centroids here in an intelligent way, of course this is going to be like a single iteration, and now this has terminated. But if I, let's say, do this in a little bit more complicated way, like here, like now I have clearly not chosen optimal seeds. Now you can see what is going on. And so in this case, the clustering algorithm still has found a good centroid, a good clustering. So if we do this again, and I now choose 4 points for a k of 4, we can see that we probably won't be finding an optimal clustering result. So now the clustering algorithm is stuck in a local minima instead of looking at a global difference. So this is like one of the weaknesses of K-means. And you can play, I can pick this randomly, and then you can do more complicated shapes. Now here, that would have, like we would say there's the 2 eyes, the mouth, and the face. So this would be kind of what we as humans see as clusters. So we went 4 centroids, but it's unlikely that this will find a good clustering. And so if we try something uniform here, so this will always find something, but that's of course not necessarily a meaningful cluster here, because it's random noise in the backend. Okay, so what does it mean? Like K-means is very sensitive to choosing a proper K. These are a couple of examples that I created with scikit-learn. And we can see that if I choose the wrong K for even such a simple example with these Gaussian blobs that we have, for 2, it's obviously not the correct clustering. For 4, this is obviously not the correct clustering. So we don't find a global optimum, we find a local optimum. One of the nice things about K-means though is it's very fast. And so what is common is to run it multiple times with some kind of randomness initialization, and then do some evaluation step, for example, like calculating Jakar index, and then pick the one with the minimum inertia, or with the minimum Jakar index. Then Kmeans also makes some assumptions about the data, especially if you use it with Euclidean distance. That first it assumes that we have roughly circular clusters of equal size. And so here are a couple of examples that of course don't work well for this K-means clustering algorithm. So these elongated shapes here, or these half moons, or this circle and this disk and a circle next to each other, they don't really work well for K-means. So here, if we had a K-means of 2, we could essentially, we see that this doesn't really work well. Also for unequal cluster size, so like a human would probably say, like this is one cluster here, this is one cluster here, and this is maybe a cluster or maybe a set of outliers. And so Kmeans doesn't really do all too well here either. Okay, so for hierarchical clustering, there's two big types. There's agglomerative clustering, where you start with each node as a cluster and merge, and then divisive clustering, where we start with one cluster and split. And I'll just be illustrating agglomerative clustering. And so I wanted to draw this. Okay, so the way one specific type of agglomerative clustering works is, like here I have a list of nodes that I'm going to use to draw a dendrogram, and here I have my nodes embedded in 2D space. This is what our data is, so you can think of this like as an X and Y. And so the way agglomerative clustering works is it looks for the distances between all those points, and then it finds the two closest points. And the two closest points here in this case are C and D. And so what we do here in the dendrogram is we draw an arc between C and D. And here the height, this here, corresponds to the distance between those two nodes. Okay, so we have now done C and D. Now we look for the next closest element, and we keep looking only, like in this one variant that I'm talking about right now, we don't look at the cluster as a whole, we look only at the nodes. So we compare A to B, A to C, A to D, A to E, A to F, and all of these iterations. And then we'll find that E to F is our second closest relationship. And so we will do something like this here. But it's a little higher than C to D. Okay, so we keep doing that, and we will find that A to B is the closest distance. That's again a little bit higher. We draw a dendrogram. And now we keep looking, and then we find that D and E are the closest elements here. And now depending on which variant of the clustering algorithm we use, this is what we would look for, just what is the shortest distance between D and E. And so we would draw that line here. But what we do here in the dendrogram is, instead of connecting D and E directly, we connect the clusters that D and E are part of. And so this is like a higher distance. And then we draw the dendrogram like this. And then we keep doing this. B to C is the next representation. And again, here in this case, we're not using the leaves, but we're using the cluster to make this connection. And we could say this is overall a pretty high difference. And so now we have created a clustering, like a hierarchical clustering, where we show the dendrogram, and we can then essentially say, okay, let's cut this dendrogram at any of those distances. So we'd say, if we want to cut this dendrogram at this point, we would simply draw like a line here, and then we would get one cluster with those two elements, one cluster with those two elements, and one cluster with those two elements. If I were to cut this line here, these here would still be in the same cluster, but these would be in a separate cluster. And that is, of course, a very fast operation. I don't have to do anything complicated with clustering. So this is a way, if I don't know too many clusters, of slicing this up easily. Yeah?
So let's say after D and E, you found that C and E are the next closest one.
Yeah.
So what do you do in that case? Because they're technically already clustered in the chart.
Yeah, so in this case, I wouldn't look at the members of a cluster that I already have connected to. I didn't say that, yes. That is definitely correct. So I'm kind of keeping, like, I'm not looking between elements that I've already connected, and all of the elements that are already in the same cluster are considered to be connected. Thank you, that's a good comment. And so, like, what I've done here is I've used, there's a couple of different linkage criteria. And here, I have used the minimum linkage distance. I have used the closest nodes in a cluster to determine whether the cluster should be merged. I could also use the maximum linkage distance. So, for example, if in this step here, the maximum linkage distance here would be between, let's say, A and F. So that would be a different algorithm. Or what is probably more sensible is to use an average linking distance. So kind of to introduce something like centroids again and use those points instead. I could easily do that as well. What is the downside of doing that? It's a little bit more computationally expensive because I could do the minimum linkage distance with just a pre-computed similarity matrix. So I don't have to look at any similarities while I'm computing the clustering. But if I calculate centroids on the fly, I have to do the calculation on the fly, of course. So here is an example of how we can use this combined with heat maps. This is a visualization tool that I built like many years ago for like a hierarchical approach to visualizing very large gene expression data sets. And so you can see here we have like the overview, then we have some details, we can do some color transformation, but what I really want to show is starting in a second. So now this is an unclustered, unsorted element. Now I'm clustering it in both directions, both in rows and columns. And I have used the hierarchical clustering algorithms where I have those dendrograms, and then here is a slider for those cutoffs. And so I can change the cluster assignments by changing the slider, and you see that the more I change, the more clusters I get. And now I have really a lot of clusters in this example. This approach is also used in this technique that I showed when we talked about multi-dimensional data. This is used in hierarchical parallel coordinates. So this here, for example, displays this essentially just at the root here. Like if we had a root, this would just be showing, like, first image would be showing the central line here would be what we have like as the centroids, plus some variation with the shading. But then if I keep cutting my dendrogram, I would get more and more and more lines until I have finally like every single element separately. Okay, so now I wanted to talk a little bit about dimensionality reduction. This is going to be even a little bit more informal. What is the idea of dimensionality reduction? The idea is to reduce a high-dimensional data set to a lower-dimensional space. And with the goal of preserving as much of the variation as possible. And then we can plot this in lower dimensional space. So I can take like a 50-dimensional space and then do something like principal component analysis and then find the first, the second, the third most important principal component, or the first, second, and third principal component, and then plot just the first two, or plot the first three in a scatter plot matrix or in a parallel coordinates plot, and so on. And so how does principal component analysis work? This is kind of like a nice example. So principal component analysis essentially finds what is the dominant, like if you have like for the first principal component, you look where do I have a vector that I can fit that describes most of the variance of the data. And so here we can see there is a linear trend So most of these points are on that line, and so the first principal component actually captures most of the variation here. And then I can update those points, and now you can see that my first principal component doesn't obviously capture as much of the variation anymore. But the second principal component, obviously, for a 2D set, it's a completely faithful representation. But if I had a higher dimensional case, that would be pretty evident. And down here is like a one-dimensional representation. So you can see like, how that changes if you change the points. This is like for a 3D example, if we have like a 3D point cloud, and then we could try to essentially find, like if we, on the x-axis here would be our principal component, so the vector of the highest variance, and if I just calculate the PCA, we could see exactly which projection of the 3D point cloud, in this case, captures the highest variance, and then for the second principal component, what is the variance, the second most, essentially, direction in which to capture the variance. And you can also do this with more dimensions, with 17 dimensions in this case. This is like preferences for certain products in England, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Things like alcoholic drinks, and cereals, and fresh fruit, and soft drinks, and so on. And so we can see that Northern Ireland consumes the least alcohol, for example. But we can't really understand what is like, which of these are the most similar overall. Like which of these countries are the most similar. And that's where us like doing principal component analysis can be quite helpful. So if we do the principal component analysis of this 17-dimensional data set, we can see that Wales, England, and Scotland are kind of like on one spectrum here, and that Northern Ireland is on the other spectrum here, on the other side of the spectrum here. And so that, if you look at that, does that make sense? It seems to make sense because we have less alcohol, we have less use of fresh food, a lot more use of potatoes, and so on. And so that's how Northern Ireland is different from these other countries. This is an example from a class project that was done when I taught this class in 2013. And so what these guys did here is they looked at an amino acid sequence to essentially predict which kind of sequences produce functional proteins. And amino acids, they have certain properties, like they're hydrophobic, or they're soluble, and other properties, and they're captured in these amino acid indices. And so they had like a really high dimensional data set and did some principal component analysis, and then plotted those principal components for each of these amino acids on the amino acid sequence. And so their hypothesis was that substitutions were, we substitute one amino acid with another amino acid, and we have low variation in the principal components, will probably not have a functional impact on the function on the protein. And so their hypothesis therefore was that the peaks here are where things can certainly go wrong. And so they identified those two regions, and they also did like a 3D molecular viewer here. They showed the sequence that was selected here in detail, and then they showed the distance in these arcs and the principal components in these histograms, and on top of the sequence here to play with this. And they submitted, this was a class project, and they submitted this then to a competition and won an honorable mention. So the last technique that I wanted to talk about is multidimensional scaling, which is essentially conceptually similar to PCA. I'm going to not discuss the math, but it's better suited for some data set. There's different approaches. It works essentially based on projecting a similarity matrix. We have the same questions that we have to ask when we look at clustering. How do we compute the similarity, and then how do we project the point? Multidimensional scaling is pretty popular for text analysis. And one problem that we have in all of these dimensionality reduction methods is that the 2D embedding that we have based on this high dimensional space is of course an approximation, right? Points that are close to each other are supposed to be similar, in fact. But this is like not a, it can't be like perfect because we have like reduced the massive data set to only 2 dimension. And so this is like a visualization technique that shows us the similarity of dissertations in certain departments at Stanford. And you see that there's the natural sciences in violet, and there's the engineering disciplines in blue, and some other natural science. I guess this is health science, the violet ones. The green ones are natural science, the blue ones are engineering. And so how this looks like here is that petroleum engineering is probably closer to neurobiology than it is to civil engineering in this projection, which of course doesn't make a lot of sense, right? So there is an artifact here in this dimensionality reduction algorithm. And so what they did is they built an interactive technique where I can click on any of those points and it would rescale the whole plot to be correct for the relationship between this one point and the other points. And if you do that for petroleum engineering, you suddenly see that all of the natural sciences and engineering disciplines are much closer to petroleum engineering than to the health sciences here. So the take-home point here being these embeddings in 2 dimensions, they can be super helpful, but you always have to take them with a grain of salt. You have to inspect actual distances. This is a great project that makes this very explicit. This was an InfoVis paper from last year. This was a bachelor's thesis. And so here we have a projection of a number of countries, and then we can actually show different things on top of it. So we can show, like, we have these attributes like educational attainment, life expectancy, life satisfaction, and then when we hover over that, it kind of shows us the areas of where this factor has a big influence. You can show, like, you display a dendrogram and on top of that and see which are the most similar ones by these connected lines. And then I can also overlay it with clusters and then explore how does the clustering compare to the projections, and are the clusters here kind of what I expect for this data set. So this is a neat way of like looking at what is the underlying meaning of complex projections. And the final slide before we start with the exercise here is this is a multidimensional scaling approach for temporal weather data. This was also last year at Viz, and so, or temporal data. This can be different things. This is global cloud circulation, and so what they did essentially is they took like some temporal vector and then calculated, like projected all of those temporal vectors onto a plane, and then connected them with a curve in sequence. And the idea was that since things change gradually, that they would probably have like nice dense areas around the same time. And so here you could see pretty well maybe some cycle that things like this could be over a year, for example, that we're getting like there's less clouds or more clouds or whatever it actually means. That's kind of one of the tricky things about projection. It doesn't really, it's not easily readable other than these dates are similar. And then there's these oscillation states here or here, where you can see things are moving from this state to the next state, and then to this state, and to the next state. And so there's like, you can see these nice oscillation patterns. And this is like a neat idea of looking at high-level trends of temporal data. Okay, so this wraps up the aggregation lecture. And now I wanted to introduce the exercise that we'll be doing for the rest of the lecture. So this is about sets, and I'm calling this a design workshop, and I'll be handing out the sheets in a second. But first let me explain what is going on. So let's assume we have a data set with 8 items in this case, and these 8 items have some kind of set relationships assigned to them. So that A, B, and C in this case, items could be people here, and A could be attributes like have a college degree, are in a certain age bracket, or it could be are a member of this tennis club or whatever. And the standard way of visualizing this is a Venn diagram, right? How many people who are in A are also in B, how many people that are in B are also in C, what is the overlap of A and B and C overall? And that's what you would visualize in a Venn diagram. The problem with Venn diagrams is they don't really scale well. This is a paper from Nature that describes the genome of the banana and compares it to the genome of 5 other plant species. And in this full Nature paper, they actually have this chart, which I call the infamous banana Venn diagram. So this is a 6-set relationship between a 6-set Venn diagram to show you the genetic relationship of the banana to other important plants like the date, rice, and some grains and so on. And can anybody tell me which is the biggest shared segment here? I see lots of people are searching.
7604.
So I think it's up here, right? There's a 1,151 shared genes. But what is wrong here? Like this 1,151 genes, or no, that's actually the 7,600 is bigger. You're right. But here, this illustrates my point well, because this big segment of 1,150 genes gets exactly the same amount of space and prominence than this tiny segment with only 40 genes. So there's no proportionality between what is important and how is it shown on the screen. So in contrast to that, down here we have a gigantic segment that only corresponds to 105 shared genes. And can you tell me which plants are represented in this segment? Clearly the banana is, right? But the other ones, like the green one is, the blue one is, the orange one is, and then we have to start looking, yeah, this one is 2, this one is 2. So it's kind of tricky to do that. It looks like this is actually the intersection of all of the sets, but you have to trace that manually. And so your goal is to fix this problem. This is not an isolated incident. Here we have the genome of the pine. This one is the genome of the rat. And I think this is worm, yeast, fly, mouse, and human, how many genes they share. And I actually counted just for nature, in 8 months we saw like really a lot of those high set Venn diagrams. And so we're gonna use this simplified data set. We're gonna use the Simpsons characters as our data set, and the characters of this characteristics of the Simpsons characters as our sets. So do they go to school? Are they male or female? Do they work at a power plant? Are they evil? Do they like Duff beer? These are going to be our attributes, or our sets. And then in addition to that, we also have attributes. How old are those people in that case? So what are some of the questions we would like to ask? Or what you should design for. Like one design guideline that I want to give you is don't always try to show all of the individuals. I've done this exercise a couple of times before, and most people try to always show everybody, but sometimes it's just as useful to show what is the biggest intersection, right? What are the biggest sets? Which sets make up an intersection is something that we care about. Like in the banana example earlier, it was hard to trace which sets make up an intersection. How big is an intersection? Not only identifying the biggest one, but how big is it? And then you should also design something that works for more than 4 sets. And so now you should be working in groups of up to 3. Get to know the data for about 5 minutes, then create 3 rapid prototypes, 3 times 10 minutes, then write up your 2 favorites in Google Docs or whatever you like in 15 minutes, and then upload. I've created like a bonus Dropbox. Upload your 2 best solutions plus some explanation to the Canvas Dropbox by 4 p.m. On this sheet it says you should post a link to your Google Doc in Slack, but I have since changed my mind. It's going to be much easier for us to grade and to look at if you uploaded to Canvas, so please upload a PDF to Canvas instead of posting it to Slack. And then next week I'll show you some of the solutions that are out there for this problem.
It killed the video.